was surreal, really, because we'd been met at the door. The president will see you in 10 minutes. Would you like a glass of champagne? And there were rockets falling outside. It was completely bonkers. And he thought, I just better take one out for a test run. And he did. And it had torpedoes in the tube. And he's up periscope, saw these German armed trawlers and sank them. Bang, bang, bang. He was a character. He was born in Odessa. He spoke 5 languages. He had sunk 5 German armed trawlers by the time he was 18. He had an MBE, 2 mentions in dispatches. He was younger than you are. In the case of the Wagner group, if they went up against any self-respecting Western military, they wouldn't last 5 minutes. Because effectively, the army had rebelled against the government.
And a general had betrayed you.
He had. The commander had sort of done the dirty on us.
Tim, welcome to the new forum. Thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So I thought I'd start by reading a quote from your book that I found quite pertinent. At the beginning, you quoted Henry Kissinger. He was asked if the world seemed a safer place now than in the past, and his answer was this. I will read. From the point of view of nuclear danger, infinitely safer. From the point of view of structure, far more chaotic. In those days, you had a Cold War. You had basic criteria of what would benefit one side or the other. Today, you have a very amorphous situation. What exactly is NATO supposed to do? What do we want to happen in Bosnia, in Asia, in the Middle East, in the long term? Some of those, of course, are slightly different now, those locations. Moreover, you have the economic and political organizations of the world at variance from each other. The economic concerns are global, the political firmly regional. And all these forces are moving at a time when the quality of political leadership is declining, because the leaders are too busy getting elected or re-elected. To what extent is this still a valid assessment?
I think it's totally valid. The only thing that's changed is in the opening part of that quote, it basically says the world is safe from nuclear conflict. I would say that all the rest of it, other than the place names, is still very relevant. I think the only thing that I would worry about in terms of change is the potential for nuclear conflict.
Do you see that as a realistic outcome in Russia and Ukraine, or are they just such egregious forms of warfare that people are too reluctant to actually use those weapons?
I hope you would be right in that they'd be reluctant to push the nuclear button. I mean, I'm an optimist. I mean, I think the threat and the danger's there, but I think that to go over that last hurdle and press the button, even if it was a one-off tactical nuclear strike as opposed to Armageddon, I think people would think twice, including Mr. Putin.
With the election of Donald Trump recently, does that change any of your thinking?
Well, I suppose if there's going to be a solution, whether you like it or not, or whether the Ukrainians like it or not, or whether Mr. Putin likes it or not, Trump's probably your man, because he doesn't care. And he doesn't care what people think. He doesn't care what the UN thinks. And if he could broker a deal, of course, he's got such a massive ego that it would make it, it would make his day. Whether the Russians will take him seriously and listen to him, or whether he can work a compromise that doesn't sell Ukraine down the river, which would be a whole different ballgame for his standing amongst his allies, because you probably saw Mr. Macron and Mr. Starmer were getting their heads together yesterday to see how best to keep the support for Ukraine alive. So I think there are a number of dichotomies here, but I think a lot of people say, "Oh God, Mr. Trump with his finger on the nuclear button, isn't that a bit dangerous?" I don't actually think it is. I'd be more worried about Mr. Putin and then what might happen next.
Do you think the optics of him perhaps being perceived as a bit of a wild man under certain circumstances are crafted strategically such that foreign aggressors are caught off guard under circumstances like this. They don't know where he's going to go, and it gives him the upper hand?
If I could answer that question with confidence, I'd probably be doing a different job. But I think he likes to treat, this is my opinion, he likes to treat world affairs like he would a business deal. And he's quite often on record as saying, keep the opposition on the back foot, keep them unbalanced, be unpredictable. And I think that's in his nature. And, sometimes internationally it could be a disaster. And it would not give confidence to the world order as it has emerged, i.e. NATO, the United Nations, etc. But on the other hand, if it achieves the aim, why not?
Coming back to your early military career, you started in the British Army. What were the early beginnings? What was your start as a soldier, and where did your journey there begin?
Well, I was a lawyer, a trainee lawyer first, which actually I think I did for 2 years, and I found it rather boring, actually, because in those days there was a difference in the legal profession in England between solicitors and barristers, and actually I should have gone down the barrister route rather than the solicitor route, and I didn't really enjoy it. But having said that, it stood me in good stead, because a basic understanding of the legal system, particularly on the commercial side or contractual side, later stood me in very good stead. But as I said, I didn't really enjoy it, and I joined the army, went to Sandhurst, and then joined my regiment and had a sort of quite a standard military career, although I was lucky in that I spent quite a lot of time in all the various hotspots, Northern Ireland, Bosnia. And then after the first Gulf War, I was sort of confronted with a career path that might not have been as exciting as I wanted it to be. Bosnia was great. I was working for a fantastic boss, General Michael Rose, and it was, I think, the first time the British Army had found itself in a place where there was no manual. There was no pamphlet to tell you how to do it. You had to make it up, and that was intriguing. But coming away from that, it would have been sort of Ministry of Defence or something. So I left.
One of your first experiences of warfare, which forms a very vivid chapter of your book, was in the Falklands in 1982.
Yeah.
It was also the first time that British soldiers I think that certainly in that decade, had experienced hand-to-hand combat. You tell a very vivid account of that. Very few people, very few people in civilian life have ever experienced those sorts of circumstances. How did you process that during the battle that you fought, Battle of Tumbledown?
Well, just to be quite clear, I was the operations officer, so I, if you like, helped the commanding officer be the architect of the battle. And whilst we were up front, we weren't up front and really personal. We were there while it was all going on, but never actually jumped into a trench to kill the enemy. But I think people process combat in entirely different ways. You never know how you're going to react. Luckily, in the British Army, most people are trained properly and are mentally equipped for it, and do their job, as unpleasant as it may be. And of course, there are plenty of examples, post-Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan, where soldiers were incredibly brave and did their job. But how you react afterwards is entirely a matter for individuals, and how you get looked after by your family, your regiment, your immediate part of the army, and then the wider army and the nation. And I think that there was quite a lot of mental scarring of people in the Falklands, but equally there were plenty of people who shrugged it off.
Did you realize anything about yourself having gone through those experiences that you didn't know beforehand?
Probably, but I can't remember. I mean, it is a formative experience, and I think you tend to take a pace back and look at life in a slightly different way. Things that might annoy you, that were trivial, you might think, why bother? There are much worse things out there.
It contextualizes it.
It contextualizes it. A very good way of putting it.
The other thing that was apparent, and this is probably a personality thing as well, is that craving might be the wrong way to characterize it, but you had an intrigue for the excitement of battle, of warfare, but very distinct from an attraction to violence, because some people are very attracted to violence, some people like the strategy, the operations side of warfare a little bit more. How would you characterize that appetite, that interest, that attraction to the adventure of warfare?
Well, I think you either like adventure and danger, or you don't. That doesn't mean you like violence. I quite like doing other exciting things as well. I've done some, climbed the old mountain.
Mont Blanc, I think.
Mont Blanc, yeah. It's not a question of trying to put yourself on the edge all the time, but it is. I mean, life would be terribly boring if you didn't do dangerous and exciting things.
Do you find it boring having returned to civilian life, having had
Actually, no, I've done my bit.
Okay, so you've got it out of your system.
Fill, but I still do stuff that other people don't do. And quite a few people have said to me, well, how come you did all this stuff and now you sit at home and write books? Well, actually, I'm quite happy doing that.
After your military career, you founded Sandline in 1996, which was a private military company. They are often conflated with mercenaries, and this is quite a loaded term with an interesting history that had a lot more honor than the term connotes at the moment. What's the differentiation between mercenary and private military company?
Well, you're quite right. In the historical context, a mercenary, whether he was a British, a German, French, Swiss, was considered an honourable profession because there weren't huge standing armies and people would hire professionalism. And it became, I suppose, post the Second World War, a pejorative term. And it conjured up an image of sort of people who like violence, people who do anything for money, not really caring who they were working for, whether it be a rogue government, a repressive regime, or a criminal organization, or whatever. And of course, there were people that did that. But on the other hand, which is why, actually, I tended to steer away from the term mercenary, because if you say it nowadays, people think, oh, all that stuff that goes with it. Whereas a private military or private security company has all sorts of checks and balances that keep it from breaking the law. And we were always quite clear that we would only work for legitimate Western governments, as opposed, for example, to the Wagner Group, which is the sort of almost going full circle back to the pejorative term, because they're not very nice people, and they happen to work for somebody who's trying to disrupt the world order rather than preserve it.
I would like to thank the English-speaking Union and the team at Dartmouth House for hosting us here for this interview. The ESU is an international organization based in the UK that promotes public speaking, communication, and cross-cultural understanding amongst young people globally. They host a variety of programs and events aimed at furthering these skills, such as public speaking competitions, school workshops, and foreign exchange programs. The English-speaking Union was formed in the belief that more effective communication between nations would lead to improved global understanding. This belief still stands strong today. As communities become ever more multicultural and societies more divided, there has never been a greater need to understand different perspectives and opinions. How has public speaking been important in your personal and professional life?
Professionally, if you're a leader in the military, you have to be able to get on your hind legs and speak. No question. You've got to do it confidently, clearly, and be able to put across your message. In the military context, really instill confidence in the people you're talking to, because you're asking them to go out and do dangerous things, put their lives at risk, really at your direction. So you've got to come across as being totally competent. And of course, that actually makes it easier later in life when you do public speaking, because it's not intimidating. When you first do it as a young officer in the army, bloody hell, and all these soldiers are looking at you thinking, who the hell's this? And if you get over that, and then gradually as you go up, you become better at it. And I was lucky, actually. I spent 2 years as an instructor in the non-commissioned officers battle school in the British Army, where you are all day lecturing and talking and public speaking to some very tough nuts, very skeptical people. And if you can do that, public speaking later in life is not a problem.
How does developing public speaking skills contribute to young people's life prospects?
I think it's very important because of what I've just said. If you can overcome your nerves, which I think everybody, it's the first time they stood up talking to an audience, quite nervous. Some people take to it, some people don't. But if you can overcome, as a young person, your reticence and your nervousness, it's going to stand you in very good stead for whatever you do. I mean, if you think of lawyers, they're public speaking all day, every day, in a courtroom. And people's freedom and livelihood depend on it. So you've got to be damn good at it. And likewise in business, if you want to put it across your message, either to your own workforce or you want to engage with somebody who you're going to do business with or you might want to work for or whatever, if you can speak confidently, and it doesn't matter that the environment, whether it's to 20 people, 200 people, or 1-to-1, it'll stand you in very good stead. So public speaking, important.
How do you differentiate between a legitimate government and one that isn't so internationally recognized as legitimate?
I suppose it's quite simplistic. How did they get there?
What about in the context of a civil war, though? That the lines aren't as cut and dry.
You see, that would always have been a dilemma. The only real civil war that I've been involved with, I've been involved in a rebellion in the context of private security in Papua New Guinea. But the civil war was really Sierra Leone, and the war was between rebels trying to overthrow the legitimate government. So the answer of which side you would take was quite clear. And I think quite rightly we'd have been castigated, if not hunted down and prosecuted, if we'd worked for the other side. So to me, it's dead simple. And people get in a muddle about this. Well, is it a bad thing to go and work for a democratically elected government or a government that's represented the United Nations that the international community recognise? I think it's quite clear.
On Papua New Guinea, this was a very famous instance in 1997, I think it was. So you were contracted by the Prime Minister, Julius Chan, at the time, in order to help quash the rebellion in Bougainville, which, as I understand it, is an island 800 or so kilometers, miles. Nautical miles, even further.
Even further.
Off the mainland of Papua New Guinea. And the context of this was that there was a rebellion, and this was a particularly strategically and economically important island, producing copper amongst other things, but also responsible for, I think it was around 45% of Papua New Guinea's exports or revenues at the time. What were the circumstances of that? What was your involvement? This was a very exciting time, I imagine, in Sandline's history.
It had its moments. The simple version is you're right. The island of Bougainville, very remote, very sparsely populated, quite primitive in terms of structure and organization and facilities. And again, you're right. The I forget, was it an Australian mining company owned the rights or bought the rights to the Bougainville copper mine, which was hugely successful, but it was open cast mining. And I think, like all these conflicts, they start for a number of reasons. This wasn't a straightforward rebellion against the government. This was about land rights, land ownership, river pollution, because certainly when I flew over the Bougainville mine, the sort of copper effluent, you could see it in the rivers. And I think it was, looking back on it, the conflict could have been avoided, but it wasn't. It happened. The BRA, the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, decided to take up arms, both and closed down the mine, and took up arms against the government. Quite difficult, 800 nautical miles away, but there was a lot of military activity. But with the benefit of hindsight, the mining company didn't get it right. They could have paid lots of money to the locals. End of problem, because actually that's what it was really about. The government could have been tougher with them. I suspect before Julius Chan, who's a very upright man, there'd probably been corruption. And the Papua New Guinea Defence Force had gone in pretty heavy. But at the same time, 20 years on, the Australians, who you'd think were the logical people to help the government of Papua New Guinea, didn't. They didn't provide them with the military capability, helicopters, etc., to enable the government to put down this rebellion. So I was asked to make an assessment of how best to help the Papua New Guinea Defence Force. We then found out, to our cost, that actually they were part of the problem and had been part of the problem and were sort of, I have to be careful what I say, but they had gone about things in a fairly ruthless way. And there was one particular instance where they had at least been complicit in something that really they shouldn't have been complicit in. And of course, we didn't know that because they presented themselves as the military force of the government. Julius Chan trusted the commander. I think also the commander felt that why do we have these outsiders coming to help us? And really our intent was to make it their plan, but to give them the wherewithal to do it, either a bit of additional planning capability or military knowledge, plus equipment to do the job, notably helicopters. And as a result, they decided they didn't want to go ahead with it.
This resulted in an interesting week for you.
It did indeed, yeah. I was detained and held under quite difficult circumstances, and the rest of my team were removed from the country, but they kept me behind. And then there was a huge sort of soul-searching legal hearing about the whole thing, because effectively the army had rebelled against the government.
And a general had betrayed you.
He had, yeah. The commander had sort of done the dirty on us. The police stayed very much loyal to the government, and there was very nearly a conflagration in the capital and the main island, but eventually it was sorted out.
People, I don't think, understand fully the extent of the activities of some of the private military companies. Often they think, intertwined with the notion of mercenaries, that they're a group of, maybe like the Expendables or some Sylvester Stallone movie, a group of people with machine guns that get parachuted in and take out a rebellion. But they provide a wider parameters of services, humanitarian aid, HOTS and mines work, a lot their mandate is actually a lot larger than just security operations.
I think that has emerged more recently in the 20-odd years since.
But that's something you were conscious of.
Yeah. What was in my mind was not to just create a military force, but what you could do to solve a situation, which was not necessarily by the use of force. It could be by training to improve the quality of the locals. It could be by supporting and protecting in a hostile environment NGOs, aid agencies, the delivery of essential supplies. I mean, you're seeing it in Gaza now. All those aid convoys will be protected by somebody. And in Africa, there have been instances where people, food relief has appeared in a famine, and if you don't have some sort of order, not necessarily provided by the local military or militias, it all continues to fall apart. So there is a sound argument for assisting in creating a stable environment and a secure environment. And I think later when we were in Iraq, our role was very much protective of people, which had a beneficial effect, and it released professional soldiers to do other jobs. Because there's a horrible equation in military operations: is how many people do you have doing nothing except protecting the others? So it's sort of diminishing amount of people that can be at the sharp end. So we did that, but we also set up a charitable foundation. We facilitated the reconstruction effort. So it's not all just about men with guns and your image of the, I can't remember what you called them, but the people parachuting in and blowing things up.
Like the Sylvester Stallone sort of.
Yeah, not
the stereotype.
Not that at all.
On the Iraq side of things, there was an article, I'm not sure if you're a fan of it or not, that referred to you as the Mercenary King and pointed to you having 20,000 soldiers under your command in Iraq and the second largest military force behind the Americans. Part of that, I'm not sure, might be that there might be a degree of truth to some of this. How did you find navigating the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and the nuances involved with coordinating with coalition forces in those efforts?
It was actually quite easy. I mean, once we had, I think initially there was a bit of, in Iraq in 2003, 2004, the coalition couldn't have done it without private security companies. Ours was not the only one. It ended up being the largest representation. You're right, we did have 8,000 people, not 20,000. But we had more than some nations, and we were spread across the country. But once you prove that what you say is what you do and nothing else, and you don't do all the things that some people were tempted to do, overrate their contracts, claim too much money, all that sort of thing, we gained the trust, particularly, first of all, the coalition, and then subsequently the Americans and the Brits, because quite soon after the end of the war, all the other countries, the Japanese, everybody else had troops there, went home. And we were really left with the Americans, the British, the Danes, the Ukrainians were, the Poles were there, but they went home. So if you establish a trust and you can deliver your services professionally as per your contract, which is a sort of overarching discipline that you have to adhere to, as well as civil law and military law and American military law and Iraqi law. You had to be licensed by the Iraqi government, which was a sort of annual bureaucratic nightmare, but it worked. Once you've done that, you can step away from any of the derogatory sort of stuff and ignore it, really, because it's rubbish. And the people that matter know that you're doing what you say you can do.
To paraphrase Crassus, I believe he was famous for saying, "You're only rich if you have your own legion." I might adjust this slightly, you're only powerful if you have your own legion. And you, to a degree, in Iraq, had your own legions. Sometimes people say power corrupts. How did you avoid being corrupted by that?
I didn't really think about it. I mean, it's quite a trite answer, but you were unable to get yourself into that position. It's not my style particularly, but the checks and balances on the private security company world, not just us, operating in Iraq, because there were plenty of others, and actually we ran a sort of intelligence and information system about the threat for them, so they could all plug into it. And in the end, it settled down. Everybody worked very well together. But you have, as I mentioned just now, your contractual obligations. And American government contracting is quite ruthless. You know, if you overstep the mark, you're gone. No cause. You know, just
so there's no
bye-bye.
margin for error.
No.
So if you don't adhere to the parameters that they
and
set.
you can't allow yourself to get ideas above your station. You work for, in our case, the American government. You also have to have an eye on your responsibilities to the host nation and the local population. Some did it better than others, but it would be very difficult to get into a position where you have your own legion, you do what you like. You can't do it. And every day, I mean, we lived amongst the American military, the State Department, the FBI, the contracting command. I mean, everybody was waiting for mistakes to be made, and we didn't make any. I mean, made some, but nothing terminal.
I'm going to read another brief quote from your book. The main aim of PMC activity is to create a situation where negotiations can start, diplomacy can work by restoring the political balance. This seems like quite a Clausewitzian take on what a PMC is. Are they inherently political entities?
Anybody who operates any form of organization in an area of conflict becomes a political, in part a political organization, because, and I think you're quoting from my first book, which refers to smaller conflicts, doesn't refer to Iraq or Afghanistan,
yes,
or multinational sort of peacekeeping or peace enforcement operations. So in a place like Sierra Leone or Papua New Guinea, if you're there at the request of the government, you're there legitimately, de facto you become part of the politics. But again, you must never lose sight of what that is and what that means, because you are only there to facilitate the rule of law, or the properly elected government to retake control of the place and then carry on its operations. So yes, you are facilitating politics.
Did you find the danger that when you were first operating in Africa, in Papua New Guinea, where oversight wasn't as stringent as it then was in Iraq, that it became down to the judgment of your morality as to the outcome of these circumstances?
You could get yourself in that position, but I think because we were pioneering, and I had some very clear ideas of what the role of private security companies should be, you just have to avoid that. You've got to steer clear of it.
A matter of acting with integrity?
Absolutely. You cannot do this. It's rather like, how can I equate it to things that people would understand? If you are in an intelligence service or an undercover policeman or a counter-narcotics person, you are rubbing shoulders with some pretty dubious people, but you absolutely have to maintain your integrity. And you can't afford to cross the line at all under any circumstances, particularly if if it involves groups of armed men, and you've got to be meticulous and very disciplined.
This sphere has given you a unique perspective on the use of force in human interaction between governments, between people. What lessons have you learned about using force that people might apply in business and other environments that might be more practically useful than
Well,
on a military basis.
I'm not about to write an idiot's guide on applying military principles to business, but I think what you learn from conflict and the military world, whether it's, you know, in somebody's armed forces or the private world, is you learn judgment, you learn restraint, you learn determination, and all those things that you could apply to the business world, because in order to be a successful businessman, you've got to do all that, but you've also got to do it with integrity. So there are lots of lessons learned there.
And you crossed the boundary to do both quite successfully.
Well, in a way, I mean, the crossing the boundary to be a successful businessman can only be done if you've got a product that works and people like it. Whether it's Coca-Cola or protecting diplomats and military people, because we looked after embassies and all sorts of things. So if you haven't got a product and you can't deliver it, you're not going to succeed, whether it's in the private security world or in the commercial world. I mean, they're both. Private security is commercial, but I mean in straight business terms.
Reverting to what we were discussing earlier about the history of mercenary culture, there were many examples. You talk in your book about the Swiss Guard, Greek mercenaries under Darius, of Persia, Caesar hiring mercenaries. Times past have rewarded strength and times brutality as well. We now live in a world where democracy and consensus is something that's put ahead of those. Are we starting to see a reversion in any parts of the world?
Well, to go back to your historical example, the Crusades and ancient Rome and Greece and all that, it was a pretty ruthless place. With the ideas and standards that we have today, were not necessarily prevalent, and people were much more aggressive, much more vicious. Although there were emerging democracies, and it's a sort of probably an unfair generalization. But to answer your question, we are much more civilized, or we like to think we are. But there are parts of the world where there is a regression to that sort of difficult and dangerous attitude, with the lack of respect for human life and all the things we take for granted, civil liberties, democracy, etc. Plenty of places in the world, but probably not as bad as it used to be.
Do you think that this sort of hard power and mercenary forces are antithetical to democracy or part of democracy's journey?
Well, it depends how they get used. And it depends whether you're talking about a legitimately established private security company or a group of armed, as you would call them, mercenaries. I think they have a place in a sort of ordered, consensual and democratic world, because they're useful. And in an era where you have smaller armed forces, and I'm talking about really the period that we were in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not talking about now, because people are now cranking up their armed forces for very sound reasons, and so they should. But when there was a time, and I think you'll have read it in the book, after the sort of perestroika and glasnost, there was the peace dividend, which was, phew, that's over. Now we don't have to spend so much money on defence. But suddenly there were things that the military in the West had to do. And our argument was that this is a cheaper way and a just as effective way of doing something with less. Because if you take a Western soldier, whether he's an American or Brit or whatever, you pay him from the day he signs the dotted line beyond his service, because if he's served long enough, he's got a pension. In the case of America, they have medical care. They're very well looked after when they leave. But with a private security company, to do the job of a group of military, like a battalion or something like that, you sign them up, you contract with them, you pay them on day one, and you stop paying them on day whatever it is. Finish, goodbye. No residual costs or whatever.
So they're incentivized. They're incentivized
They're
to keep
incentivized
costs
because they get
low,
paid.
to be efficient.
and they're paid very well. I mean, we were very conscious of terms and conditions. We paid them extremely well to go out and basically be prepared to be shot at, or worse, blown up with IEDs and things, doing a job that they were used to because they were all ex-professional soldiers, being paid more than they would have got in the army, but for a finite time. That was it. They were over and done with, and when they could have been hurt, and we were very conscious that their equipment had to be good. In some cases, it was better than some of the armed forces we were working with. Their medical support had to be top-notch, because you can't expect people to do that without knowing that if they get hurt, they're going to be looked after. And the Americans were fantastic. We had as good medical care support as the American military. So if I had somebody wounded in an IED attack, very quickly there'd be American evacuation helicopter. And all our people went, if they were seriously hurt, they would go out of Iraq to a place called Landstuhl in Germany, which was a huge American military hospital. And if they were really badly injured, they would go to America, whatever nationality they were, as long as they were on contract with the US government. So, you have to take care of those things.
You brought up the rearmament, or alluded to the rearmament, yes, of the West. The West are facing off against the Russian army, more recently the North Korean army, but also the Wagner mercenary group. They are mercenaries in the more 20th century incarnation of what that word means. Do the West need answers to that in the form of their own, maybe slightly more adversarial private military corporations, mercenary groups, to combat those private threats?
No, I think because in the case of the Wagner group, if they went up against any self-respecting Western military, they wouldn't last 5 minutes. And that was proved in Syria. They made the mistake of attacking some anti-Assad forces. And they didn't know the American Special Forces were there. And it resulted in a complete...
Wasn't it drone strikes or something?
Well, it was airstrikes. I think it was airstrikes.
Okay.
But if you tangle with the Americans, that's the first thing that's going to happen to you, because they're very sophisticated in terms of artillery support, drone support, fixed wing support. You're going to get creamed. The sort of second part of your question, do you think private security companies should, in this environment, be more proactive? I don't think they should, because, as I've tried to illustrate, their role is a support role. And its purpose, in a nutshell, is to free up trained frontline soldiers from not doing static guarding or escorting duties, but to be at the sharp end and conduct military operations. So it's a force multiplier, if you like, to use a military term.
How do you think the introduction of the North Korean troops in Russia will fare against the Western-backed Ukrainian army?
They're too busy watching porn, aren't they?
Oh, really? Okay. You smiled slightly when I brought them up earlier, so I was curious if they're I don't know, tactically, are they at a disadvantage?
I suspect, I mean, I don't know very much about the North Korean armed forces. I expect they're motivated. I think they're quite tough, because if you look back at the Korean War, they're tough people, the Koreans. But on a modern battlefield, and they'd have no experience, have no combat experience, very little, I mean, of any note. Are they technologically sophisticated? Do they train in an environment? They're probably quite good at clearing trenches, because the war in Ukraine is this funny dichotomy between high-tech, real modern warfare, drone swarms and drone warfare, and the inability to hide, difficulties of camouflage and concealment, heat monitoring, and then there's trench clearing. And I think the British Army's gone back to learning how to clear trench systems.
It's reverted to 20th century warfare.
Well, I think you now have this hybrid of 20th century warfare and 21st and 22nd century warfare.
Trenches and drones, right?
Trenches and drones. So I think, to answer your question about the Koreans, they'd probably be very good at clearing trenches. I expect they're aggressive and they're fired up to do it. Whether they can cope with the nuances of technology of the modern battlefield, I doubt it. But, on the other hand, the Russians have been throwing soldiers at the problem. which is why their casualty rate is enormous. And I suspect they would use the North Koreans in a similar way.
And these soldiers are also substandard in terms of their training, in terms of their equipment, in terms of supplies.
The North Koreans?
The Russian soldiers,
Well,
because they're bringing in a lot of conscripts at the moment.
Conscripts, or people paid a bounty to go or emptied out of a jail. These are not highly trained professional soldiers like the British Army or like the Ukrainians have become.
Working in the Middle East and in Africa, you've seen some incredibly violent circumstances in both. How does that violence differ?
Between the Middle East and Africa?
So when you're looking at an African civil war versus the way that the
violence is violence. It's either the effect of weapons delivered as a means of killing the enemy.
But one side's not more strategic, one side's not more brutal there.
Well, I think you then have the sort of the thing that all Western armies adhere to, and indeed properly constituted private security companies, the law of armed conflict. I mean, you don't massacre people, you don't torture them, you don't make examples of people in villages, which tends to happen in conflicts in Africa, or indeed, if you were fighting ISIL in the Middle East, that's more their form, and you will find that the people that Western military engage with at the moment, possibly including national forces, are pretty unrestrained by things like the law of armed conflict, whereas ours are. And I am sure that if British troops are deployed anywhere, or American troops, that sort of stuff doesn't happen.
To round off your journey with Sandline and Aegis, there was an interesting story you told in your book where you had gone to visit a certain African head of state, and it quickly transpired that you weren't just consulting with them, but you were their getaway vehicle. Essentially,
there was a civil war going on, and I went to see the head of state, officially in his palace with his advisors, and there was a discussion about how best we might be able to help him. And then the meeting broke up. And as we went out of the meeting, I thought, what are all these Louis Vuitton trunks doing here? And his wife...
It's a telling sign when falling leaders have lots of luggage lined up.
I mean, it was surreal, really, because we'd been met at the door. The president will see you in 10 minutes. Would you like a glass of champagne? And there were rockets falling outside and all sorts of things. It was completely bonkers. But anyway, you're right. And then, he said he needed to go to a regional capital to continue the fight. And by this time I was thinking, oh, really? And I said, well, we've got a very small aeroplane. We can get from A to B. I quickly rang the pilot, who said, for God's sake, get down here. The place is falling apart at the airfield. But we persuaded him he had to abandon his Louis Vuitton trunks and half his entourage. But we did take his wife, I think, and his doctor, most important, and one of the trunks, which I suspect didn't contain too many clothes.
I imagine.
So that was a bit of a thing that we walked into that I wasn't expecting. And as we took off, the shells were landing down the runway behind us.
Wow. Wow. I'd like to come on to your latest book, and it is about the British spy Biffy Dunderdale, A Suspicion of Spies. He seems like he formed the basis for the character of James Bond. He was good friends with Ian Fleming. He seems to have led a life of intrigue, of glamour, of mystery. Can you give us whet our appetites, give us an insight into this elusive character?
Well, I'll deal with the Bond thing first, because that's what everybody immediately said. Biffy Dunderdale, James Bond. Not quite true. He was a lifelong friend of Ian Fleming's, or certainly from 1940. But Bond is, I think, I'm very confident to say, is an amalgam, a pastiche of lots of people that Ian Fleming knew and a big chunk of Ian Fleming. is in there as well, or who Ian Fleming wanted to be, and of course the sort of the stuff that goes with James Bond, the lifestyle, is taken from here, there, and everywhere, including Ian Fleming's own experience. But Biffy did help him write From Russia with Love. There's no question about that. He provided, and I've seen a copy of the previous book, which I think is Diamonds Are Forever, which says to Bill, which is this is real name, Wilfred. Thanks for your help on the next one. And the next one was Russia with Love. And I sort of coincided with when Biffy was leaving the Secret Intelligence Service. But to go to Biffy himself, I mean, he was a larger-than-life character, although he always maintained his secrecy, his operational security. And he was well known for tapping his nose and saying, no, you don't ask me about that. I've signed the Official Secrets Act. I can't talk about it. And he wouldn't talk about it, although he was a great raconteur. He loved telling stories, but nothing that would compromise his intelligence work at all. And in fact, he was involved in getting the British the first working copy of an Enigma machine.
From Poland, right?
From Poland. And he had a very long association with the Poles and the Polish Free Intelligence Service during the Second World War. And he would probably say that actually of all the Allied intelligence services, the Poles were the most effective. But he later in life, in 1974, when the Enigma secret came out that we had this thing, he poo-pooed it and said, actually, I did much more interesting stuff than that. He's on record, officially on record, as saying that. But he was, he was a character. He was born in Odessa. He spoke 5 languages. He had sunk 5 German armed trawlers by the time he was 18. He had an MBE, 2 mentions in dispatches. I mean, he was younger than you are.
I feel that I need to accomplish more. I mean, German ships, because he was taking a submarine to Russia, between 2 territories in Russia.
No, his father, who was a real entrepreneur, he had sold. He'd done a deal with the Russian Imperial Navy, with the Tsar, and he'd sold them several submarines, 5, I think. But they were from America. They were from the Electric Boat Company. And because of export constraints, they had to be shipped in kit form, not as a full submarine. And they were shipped across the Pacific to Vladivostok, taken in kit form on the Trans-Siberian Railway, and taken to St. Petersburg. Biffy helped assemble them, and he thought, I just better take one out for a test run. And he did. And it had torpedoes in the tube, and he's up periscope, saw these German armed trawlers and sank them, bang, bang, bang. And I know it to be true because, I've read Biffy's handwritten notes. He wrote for his family what he'd got all these medals for. And these are 2 Russian imperial decorations. That's the account.
He got a knighthood from the Tsar for that.
That's quite an amusing story too. As a result of this, the Tsar got to hear it and said, well, we must give this man a decoration. I want to give him the order of, I think it was St. Olaf. And the courtier said, well, you can't, because he hasn't got the order before it. And he said, give him both.
Fantastic. If you could ask Biffy one question, what would that question be?
That's a very good point. I had a list of about 50 questions I could ask him. I would ask him why he didn't think of all his achievements, because they're considerable. We don't have time to talk about all of them, or probably any of them. I would say, why did you poo-poo the Enigma thing? Because there is no doubt that getting it here 16 days before the outbreak of war and delivering it to the government code and cipher school made huge advantages. I mean, we had all the clever people up there, like Alan Turing and others, who were working on it, but they didn't have one. And Biffy got it to them. And
they leveraged his success in delivering that machine.
Indeed.
To win the Second World War.
Yeah. Well, I think, I'm not exaggerating by saying if we didn't have what was known as the ultra-secret, we'd cracked Enigma and we could read all the German encoded signals, the war might have gone very differently. In fact, very differently. And that's why it was imperative during the war that never got out.
Tim, thank you very much. A fascinating note to end on. Thank you for your time.
We're done.
We're done. Thank you.
Great.